What I want to do, I was told to speak for about 25 minutes, and I want to speak not just actually about the Eastern Mediterranean, because the sorts of problems I'll be addressing are pan-Mediterranean problems. I think that when we're talking about the Mediterranean, we have to remember that the fundamental feature of the history of the Mediterranean has been, for 3,000 years, interaction across east to west, north to south, the whole space. But I'll try and concentrate a bit on the Eastern Mediterranean. And the question I'm trying to deal with is how a historical approach to the Mediterranean can help us to understand modern dilemmas. Now, what I've argued in my book, The Great Sea, is that the history of the Mediterranean reveals a series of lengthy phases of integration followed by disintegration, periods of relatively short disintegration which have sometimes been calamitous, characterized by severe economic contraction and by political disjuncture. I'm sorry, there's a message on the screen, but anyway, ignore it. Viewed from this perspective, the Mediterranean is at this moment disjointed, fractured, fragmented. Some historians even talk of the death of the Mediterranean. And what I would suggest is that this is a deviation from its character over most of the past millennia. The challenge that we face is to bring the facing shores together so that they interact creatively in the political, economic, and cultural arenas, and so that an integrated and secure Mediterranean can once again come into being. Because taken as a whole, the Mediterranean has had great economic potential throughout its history. During periods of integration, the sum of its parts has always been impressive. Just to take an example from long ago, if we take the case of the massive and regular grain traffic that supplied ancient Rome with food supplies from Tunisia and Egypt. Now, no one before or after the Romans has managed to achieve political control over the entire sea, which they called Mare Nostrum, our sea, and they controlled it for several hundred years. Nowadays, however, we're in a very different situation. The countries on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, by and large, look to Brussels, maybe to Berlin or Frankfurt, depending on your interpretation, for a solution to their economic problems. I would say they've turned their back on the Mediterranean. Now, economic interdependence can obviously do a great deal to reduce tensions, though in the wrong conditions it can also inflame them. And I'm reminded here about, I know that the whole issue of natural gas is certainly going to come before you again and again, but as these gas supplies were identified, the sort of sense that lots of different countries might be competing for control of these gas supplies, might be putting in their own claims, that sort of issue can also increase tension. So we have to keep in mind the balance between the way in which economic assets can be a source of strength and a source of conflict. There's another feature of the Mediterranean in past times that has been emphasized and that has a bearing on modern dilemmas. The Mediterranean has been a principal meeting point for the three Abrahamic religions. This interaction has been regular and at times intense, sometimes hostile, but often creative, and we can think nowadays with the rise of so-called Islamic State of the hostile dimensions to that confrontation. It's tempting, of course, to think of the period of the Crusades, the great Spanish-Turkish wars of the 16th century, as proof of the lack of integration in the Mediterranean. But we can also see long peaceful interludes during which Christian and Jewish merchants established themselves in trading colonies along the coasts of North Africa and the Levant, in which consumers in Western Europe eagerly bought Eastern goods obtained from or through the Mediterranean, silks and sugar, spices brought up the Red Sea and then into the Mediterranean through Alexandria and Beirut and so on. Trading communities from Venice, Genoa, Florence and Barcelona built the commercial institutions we know today, banks, insurance, maritime law, to serve the interests of their trade routes that encompass the Mediterranean. Religious barriers did not have to be commercial barriers. Now, all of this created a series of diasporas around the shores of the Mediterranean. Cosmopolitan port cities emerged, that acted as hosts to mixed communities of people of many religions, ethnic origins, and cultural outlooks. We could take the example of Istanbul, which for the moment I will count as a Mediterranean city. I mean, one could debate whether it really is. But the area north of the Golden Horn, Pera Galata, was home to thousands of Italian merchants in the Middle Ages and after. The extreme case of a cosmopolitan Eastern Mediterranean city is Alexandria, ever since its foundation by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. Early in the 20th century, Europeans accounted for 15% of the population, though they exercised most of the economic power. In 1927, there were about 49,000 Greeks in the city and 24,000 Italians. Overlapping with various nationalities, there were 25,000 Jews. And influential Muslim families, including the royal family, hailed from Turkey, Albania, Syria, Lebanon, and so on. And they, as much as the settlers of European descent, wished to identify strongly with European and particularly French culture. A 19th century ruler of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, expressed the view that, I quote, Egypt must become part of Europe. Nationalist movements within the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire, beginning in the 19th century in Greece, challenged this pluralistic outlook. And in an age of rising nationalism, try and get that back. Sorry, it's gone. Oh dear. In an age of rising nationalism, expulsion, flight from danger, forced assimilation, and even in the case of the Sephardim of Salonika, mass extermination, transformed one city after another. All right, so I was talking about these multi-ethnic, these cosmopolitan cities, and really they had ceased to exist, it seems to me, by the 1950s with Nasser's expulsions from Egypt. Maybe you could make a case for Beirut after that for a time, but although tourist maps of Istanbul still very insistently show where there are synagogues, Armenian churches, and Greek churches, we know that these communities have shrunk enormously under pressure from Ataturk's emphasis on Turkish national identity. Well before Ataturk's remarkable career, Ottoman sovereignty in North Africa, which was often more theoretical than real, was replaced by direct colonial rule on the part of competing powers in Western Europe. A small corner in the far west for Spain, large tracts for France and Italy, and Britain exercising overwhelming influence in Egypt. And in the era of colonialism, starting with the French conquest of Algeria in 1830, a new rapport was created across the Mediterranean, a hegemonic one that insisted on the more civilized character of the northerners as opposed to the inhabitants of its southern shores. And the image that you have in front of you is actually, it's a French image of the Italian conquest of Libya, beginning of the 20th century, and you can see how the Italians look terribly civilized, but I'm afraid the Libyans look really rather barbaric. You've got the steamships in the back, which symbolize, of course, technology, advance, and so on. And you've got this remarkable figure carrying the flame of civilisation into Libya. In 1881, when the French protectorate was created in Tunisia, the region already contained 70,000 Italian settlers, many of them from Sicily, and 12,000 settlers from the tiny island of Malta. Now, by the time of decolonization following the Second World War, the European colonies in North Africa were home to 1.5 million settlers from France, Spain, Italy, and elsewhere, well over 1 million in Algeria alone, among whom actually, if we're talking about Algeria, only a minority could claim a French origin. There were a great many, as I say, who were actually Spanish and Italian. So this idea of a common Latin rather than French origin was reflected in the colonialist boast that these people were restoring Latinity to the Mediterranean 1,500 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. And this idea is actually, those of you who've read Fernand Brauddel's famous book on the history of the Mediterranean, you will actually see that idea reflected there. He was very much influenced by it. Well, here's an image of General de Gaulle in Algeria at a time when he was promising not to release it from French rule. The colonists' descendants were, of course, to depart back to Europe in the second half of the 20th century, accompanied by large numbers of indigenous inhabitants, many of whom then settled on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, above all in southern France, so that tensions generated in North Africa during the era of decolonization were then transferred to cities such as Nice and Marseille. Now, this emancipation of the colonized from the colonizers in the second half of the 20th century has had several important effects, notably the fracturing of the Mediterranean into northern and southern zones that to a large extent operate apart from one another. So places such as Algiers and Alexandria, once celebrated for the meeting of cultures, religions, and peoples, they're now monochrome cities inhabited solely by the majority population of the interior. If you go to Alexandria nowadays, it's a completely Arab city. Now, to say this is not to defend the actions of the colonizers, which notably in Algeria were often brutal and counterproductive. But as we know, decolonization coincided with attempts of the Soviet Union to establish a foothold within the Mediterranean. And as a result, it was trying to create political and economic alliances that accentuated existing tensions within the Eastern Mediterranean, notably that between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Mentioning Israel, of course, we have to mention that the Jews in particular disappeared from all those lands in the Mediterranean where they had formed an integral and highly productive part of a larger society, moving to one corner or sometimes to France, but bringing to an end a 2,000-year history of diaspora around the shores of the Mediterranean. Now, seen from this perspective, the creation of Israel was another episode in the fragmentation of the Mediterranean into national entities as different ethnic and religious groups carved out their own territories as peoples were shunted around, beginning with the Greeks and the Turks in the population exchanges of the 1920s. To say that isn't to deny the very special nature of migration into Israel, expressed in the very varied origins, often not Mediterranean origins, of those Jews who came to settle, and in the religious impetus that motivated some, though not necessarily all of them. And of course, we're now discovering, with the collapse of Syria, that a state in which a variety of religious groups had to some extent coexisted, that once again we're beginning to see how a community which, at least in recent times, tended to promote itself as a place in which there was tolerance of a variety of religious views, that this too is breaking down. We can all see, indeed we see virtually every day, that the disparities in wealth between the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean have stimulated an intensive, illicit and perilous human traffic across the sea that it seems impossible to control. This traffic, we have to remind ourselves, was already flowing strongly before the collapse of Syria and before the persecutions in Iraq and further east. The Mediterranean has become the theatre in which many migrants from Black Africa, we don't tend to hear about them quite so much, certainly in the United Kingdom, have tried, often at the risk of their life, to enter the wealthy lands of the European Union. And then, of course, this migration has been compounded by the situation in Libya in particular, with massive migration out of that country during the current upheavals, and, well, I don't need to mention the migration into the Aegean and beyond, which part of which isn't simply, of course, from Syria, but some of it from much further east, from as far east as Afghanistan. This black migration is likely to continue to grow as climate change threatens livelihoods in the savannah regions. The large mass of quite well-educated West Africans, North Africans and Middle Easterners in their 20s, predominantly male, with no employment opportunities, has fueled the apparently unstoppable flow of migrants across the Mediterranean, whether out of Turkey or out of Libya or through Morocco, towards Greece, Italy and Spain, ultimately they hope towards Germany, Sweden and elsewhere. Now, it's not for a moment to deny that civil conflict in Syria, Libya and Iraq has created the largest refugee problem since the Second World War. The point I'm trying to make is that one does need to distinguish, despite some overlap, between economic migrants and genuine refugees. Many of the young men reaching Germany speak good English, have raised the funds to pay people traffickers, and are not drawn from the really poor sections of Arab society whose members are stuck in misery back home. This migration, accompanied by much danger and humiliation, stands in stark contrast to another type of migration that also dominates the modern Mediterranean. It's temporary but transformative. People from Northern Europe and elsewhere converging on the Mediterranean in search of summer sun, a mass phenomenon of the late 20th century that has transformed local industries, the labour market, the physical appearance, even the social and cultural norms of towns and villages along virtually the entire Mediterranean coastline of Spain, France, and Italy, and increasingly in Turkey, Tunisia, Israel, and other Mediterranean lands. Now, tourism brings certainly short-term prosperity to many areas, but its environmental effects are severe, a topic to which I shall return. What we see is a heavy interdependence between the tourist industry and the economies of Northern Europe, injecting a further element of fragility into the economy of most Mediterranean countries, particularly at times of political upheaval, when popular destinations are suddenly rendered inaccessible. You think of the crisis during the breakdown of Yugoslavia, when that coastline became no longer an area favoured by tourists, and in the last few months, the terrorist outrages in Tunisia and Egypt, which have led to a massive drop in tourism towards the Tunisian coast and the Egyptian beach resorts, with drastic effects on the economy of both countries. Now, while this has been happening, the southern flank of the Mediterranean has, in my view, been deserted, if you like, by the countries on the northern flank, which saw their destiny as a European one, turning their backs on the Mediterranean to participate in a European Union whose strongest economies lie away from the Mediterranean. I could point, for instance, to the weakness in the economy of every single EU territory within the Mediterranean, with two exceptions, but they are minute exceptions. Malta, growth of about 5% per annum. Gibraltar, even tinier. Gibraltar's 5%, Malta's 2.5% per annum. But we're also talking about Greece, Cyprus, Italy, Spain. 3 or 4 years ago, one would have said that if there's a tiger economy within the Mediterranean, it clearly must be Turkey, a state still trying to decide on its role in the wider region, as I'm sure we'll hear. And it had these very impressive rates of economic growth, which provided a startling contrast to its neighbour Greece, a better performance than Romania or Bulgaria, which had just entered the EU, a comparable performance to the Baltic states. But this has not been sustained, and it's important to emphasize that trade, not really with the Mediterranean, the real source of strength was trade with Germany rather than with the Mediterranean. That was an important ingredient in this Turkish economic success. The other successful economy in the Mediterranean seems to me to be that of Israel, with its particularly impressive record for the creation of start-up high-tech companies. But obviously there are problems here in terms of Israel's relationship with its immediate neighbours and its integration into wider Mediterranean networks. Well, the big question is how the relationship between the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean can be reconstituted. If you look at Tunisia on the eve of the Arab Spring, you'll see that there was a great deal of investment, not just from France, but from China in Tunisia at that particular point. It really seemed to be a country which was attracting attention from the wider world, but such successes now seem precarious. Or to give the example of Morocco building a massive new port at Tanger Med, trying to draw benefit competitively, actually, in confrontation with Algeciras, trying to draw benefit from the traffic through the Straits of Gibraltar. We still need to see whether that is going to be a success. Morocco asked to join the European Union in 1987. Of course, it was rejected. I think they knew they were going to be rejected, but there are a number of agreements that tie the EU to Morocco. However, there's also clearly an economic disjuncture within Morocco between a growingly wealthy middle class, upper middle class, and the condition of the urban and rural majority. Well, we can't ignore the recent attempts to bind together the countries of the Mediterranean in a diffuse league of states that would be able to address common problems. irrespective of political differences, involving Israel and the Arab countries. And the first major initiative was the so-called Barcelona process of 1995, in which both the Mediterranean countries and the members of the EU were involved, and plans for the creation of a free trade area in the Mediterranean, to create that by 2010. Well, it hasn't happened yet. The idea of a Mediterranean Union is more of an ideal than a practical reality, therefore, but there are matters, urgent matters, that need to be addressed together by all Mediterranean nations. Obviously, the issue of migration, promotion of trade between the EU and non-EU countries within the Mediterranean, and not to mention the sharp confrontations that exist in Israel and the Palestinian territories. Now, particularly important is the protection of the maritime environment. I don't know if we're going to hear very much about that in the next day, but this is an issue where the countries around the Mediterranean really need to work together. We're looking at massive, catastrophic change as a result of overfishing, as a result of the dumping of effluents and plastics. It's not simply a question of climate change, it's a question of things which relate very much to the mistreatment to which we have subjected the Mediterranean in the 20th century. And this is something which can only really be resolved by international collaboration on a scale that is totally lacking just now. But it's important to get old rivals and enemies to sit round the table together. I mean, there has been a little bit of progress in this direction, but we really need to see some action. To conclude, well, the current crisis in the Eurozone means that resolving the relationship between the European Union and the non-EU countries around the Mediterranean has become an even less significant priority, it seems to me, for existing members of the Union. The danger of a sudden Grexit, Greek exit from the euro and ultimately from the Union, has diminished, but there are still fundamental structural problems in the economic relationship between wealthier and poorer EU countries, and these have to be addressed more urgently than is the case at the moment. We also have, of course, the possible effects of British policy. If Britain goes for what we call Brexit, British exit from the European Union, this may well have a sort of knock-on effect, domino effect within the European Union, and maybe other countries may decide to join us. So while Britain's status in the EU remains uncertain, while the Eurozone fails to show signs of healthy economic growth, while the whole question of migration, both within the Union, but also, of course, into the Union from outside, through the Mediterranean, remains such a live issue, attention to Mediterranean problems is bound to be limited, with the exception of the question of migration, which there doesn't seem to be an obvious solution to anyway. Migration will not die down, even in the unlikely case of the Syrian and Libyan civil wars coming to a peaceful end soon. It is something that the 21st century is going to see continuing, whether from Black Africa or from the Middle East, year in, year out, for decades. So, as you can hear, I'm something of a pessimist. The prospects for the creation of tight bonds linking all the Mediterranean countries in common enterprises continue to fade. The 21st century Mediterranean, to my mind, is broken and in need of repair. So I hope that this conference might be able to do something to suggest ways in which it can be repaired. Thank you very much.